watching Money Talk Viewpoint, and I'm Chantel Leeson. Welcome to our show today. Let's do a special guest for today. This is Judith Pearson. I got it right. Judith and I, we've talked a little bit before the show about what you did. I want you to share with the audience. Now, we talked about is it trust liability? Am I right?
Yeah, it's really looking at risk management and best practices for all the varying wealth transfer vehicles that we see in today's world. So whether it be high net worth, ultra high net worth, transferring their assets through trusts, or looking at private trust companies, setting up family offices, anything having to do with wealth transfer vehicles is what we look at. And we help families understand what the roles, responsibilities, and liabilities are of each role, how to create best practices to avoid any kind of litigation. And in case there is litigation, we put insurance policies in place.
You know, I'm in family office, and a lot of people like myself who started with in the investment side. Some of us went from investment institutional to retail, and then ended up in family office because we want to work more closely with our clients to give them the best possible advice and services, and not just to jump into how much commission we're going to make. And I didn't know much about trust liability. I'm going to ask you a question. Tell me about your background. I'm going to put you on a speaker view. I just want the audience to see you. Tell me about your background and how you got started in where you are.
So obviously with my gray hair, I've been around quite a while. I started in the property casualty insurance industry in 1982, handling directors and officers liability insurance from both an underwriting and a brokerage perspective. And I go way back there because when I started in D&O insurance, we were literally teaching boards of directors what their fiduciary duties were. And it wasn't until merger mania of the 80s did you really get the construct of what we have today. And I believe trustee liability or family office liability, whatever you want to call it, is exactly where D&O was back in 1982. We're really talking to all the various people who serve in these roles. What are their roles? Who's talking to them about their roles and responsibilities? I mean, these are enormous jobs and their liabilities because they are putting their personal assets at risk. So I always start back there. I left in year 2000 and co-founded a company that provided title insurance for fine art and other important collectibles. And I got a few things out of that. One is there aren't many insurance people who have actually founded companies, raised capital, and had a liquidity event, and all the challenges in between. Like we had an investment manager who almost bankrupted us. We had a hedge fund whose, big bad investments became our problem, even though we were a small company. And we got through all of this with no litigation. So I've actually gone through the process and understand it from the business owner's point of view. It also gave me really interesting insight into tax, trust, and estate issues for personal property. And that's really how I got to where I am today. We sold the company in 2010. I lived out my employment agreement and thought, I don't really want to be a one product salesperson for a company I don't own anymore. And I probably have one career left in me. What am I going to do? So I went to the family offices, the trust and estate attorneys, the wealth managers, et cetera, that I've been working with. And I'm like, look, you guys know me as the art girl. I did that for 15 years, but I actually have this other big background. What's the number one issue your clients are facing today? And everybody said trustee liability. So I did a deep dive and started understanding what most of you in the family office wealth management world already know, that there's this transition from traditional trust to directed trust. There's, a lot of private trust companies that are getting created. It's essentially the wealthy families now have a lot of different structures that they can utilize to serve their purposes, right? So when somebody says, what should I do? Of course, I'm just an insurance person. I'm not, I don't design these vehicles, but my answer is always, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And then once you figure that out, we can talk about the risk characteristics. So that's kind of my history and how I got to where I am. And once I understood what was going on in the actual creation of these structures, I went to the insurance companies, wondering what they're doing in this space. And essentially they all said nothing. Premiums are too small. They're thinking about bigger risks. Most insurance brokers don't really understand tax, trust, and estate issues. And I said, and you're not keeping up with anything. So you're not, your policies don't work. So let's rewrite everything and solve the problems that our families are facing. So it's probably a little longer than you wanted, but that's kind of how I got to where I am today.
No, but you covered a lot of material here. I want to ask you, so what do you think are the hot topics in the trust industry, in trust in general?
Oh gosh. So hot topic number one, if we want to just say what's on everybody's radar, what should be on everybody's radar, is the Corporate Transparency Act. That was voted in last January 1 to be implemented by January 2024. And what that says is if you're a beneficial owner of an LLC, you have to now report very specific information to the government. And in many situations, when you're a trustee that has LLCs in the assets that they're managing, they may have to be the reporting agency. And so that comes with both civil and criminal penalties. And so our trustees need to understand that's the law. So I'd say from the area that I don't see a lot of people focusing on, that's the number one. I think the number two piece of it, and this is a bigger, longer discussion, but really understanding if you're going to accept this role as a trustee or some of the other roles that have been created in these evolving structures, you need to really understand what the roles are, what the responsibilities are, what are your strengths, where do you need to develop additional skill sets, and then understanding your personal liability and how to manage it. I mean, those are really big issues that most people aren't talking about.
I find in the family office space, and this is newer for me because again, I came out of from institutional to retail and then the family office. Trust, the relationship between people within that entity, trust for us is incredibly important. We have to trust our partners and who we're working with. That's the first level of getting into building other aspects in the organization. I want to ask you though, how are the different silos interconnected?
So if you think about all the various structures and all the advisors that our well-advised families are working with. So let's start with the family office, right? So you have the wealth owner who's created a family office. And we all know that if you've seen one family office, you've seen one family office. So I'm going to separate it from the multifamily office to the single family office first. So we have a wealth owner who's created a single family office. They have either outsourced amazing, support advisors, the investment advisor, the CPA, the lawyers, the what have you. But as they're implementing the various structures, they now have to appoint different people. So if you're in a family office and you're managing trusts, the question is, who do you appoint as the trustee? Should it be a family member? Should it be an advisor? Should it be a professional trustee? Should it be an institutional trustee? Any of these people fill the role? And then many people will hire an institutional trustee for certain roles, but then they may say, I really trust my CPA, or I really trust my lawyer. And then they ask the drafting attorney who's known the wealth owner for, so many years, that has been protecting his family, knows all the issues, to serve as trustee, right? So that's where all this starts getting intersected. On the advisors are serving in these roles, the family offices are serving in these roles. New structures allow for family members to serve in the roles that they should be in, not the ones that they shouldn't be in. And what I mean by that is especially in what I call the directed trust environment, which is, if we could step back for a second, a traditional trustee's roles are basically investment, reporting, and distribution. Now, there's a lot of complication to all of those, but that's essentially it. In the directed trust environment, we can bifurcate those roles. And so if you're going to hire an administrative trustee or hire an investment professional or hire the CPA to do reporting, what's really left? Well, that's the opportunity to the family to be able to have the input for the legacy piece of it. And I think that's really important. A family member should never be put in a position to make the difficult decisions. You know, when there's a distribution that could be a little complex, they shouldn't be making that because there's too much conflict of interest, there's too much emotion around it. However, I do believe that families should be very involved in the legacy and the directing and things like that. The newest evolution of that structure is now the private trust company. Not that the private trust company is new, but there are new regulations that allow for, again, my personal preference of allowing the families to have the control of the assets, to keep their privacy, and to have serve in the roles that they should be serving. And with a private trust company, you can now institutionalize that for your family. Yeah. So if you want to make a change, you no longer have to go through rewriting documents or amending documents. You can now replace boards of directors, committee members, what have you. So again, I know that this is a lot of information, but this is how it all intersects, because there's different roles, lots of advisors serving our families, and a lot of people serving in multiple roles.
You know, and that it may sound complicated, but I think once a person gets into the right entity that can help them work through these issues, I'm going to be reaching out to you, you know that.
I hope so.
those are important factors. Let me ask you, what are the trends you're seeing in families implementing the wealth transfer vehicles?
So I am seeing a huge uptick in the private trust companies. Some of the things that I think are more interesting is looking at some of the families who have created significant equity with businesses. Let's take Patagonia, for example. I see a lot of trends in, you know, really wanting to have control over more than what I would call the ESG, but truly the mission of the family and the founder, and creating 50C4 entities. So they're nonprofit entities that own the stock that can continue the mission of the founder, which I find fascinating. I think it's a really interesting structure. I think that over time, we're going to see what's going to play out in terms of the risk characteristics, because as we all know, everything changes. We can just look at, you know, the Paul Newman litigation that we saw, where Paul Newman set up a certain structure that really isn't so dissimilar from what we're talking about, but then the taxes changed. And so they had to change the structure, which changed some of the risk characteristics. So all I'm saying is I love the structure. I think it's fascinating, but we have to keep close eye on what are the risk characteristics. So that's one. Another one is, I don't know if you've heard of B corporations, which are essentially certified that they're really a benefit corporation benefiting the ESG type things. I've heard a couple of trusts wanting to look at being a B trust. So again, it's the family members creating a legacy of what they really want to see, of what they want to do in the world. So there's a ton of trends. It just depends on where you are in scale, what you want to do with your family, what is the legacy, and what do the family dynamics look like? Are there people in the family that have been trained and engaged to carry on the legacy? That's a whole nother issue.
Yeah. You know what? As you were talking, I was thinking, because there's a new burgeoning society within our society that's growing in wealth. that did not exist in the past. And they're not necessarily, sometimes they're 22-year-olds who are in IT, but sometimes they're 65-year-olds who have had a wealth of knowledge and are able to put that to work after they've left their corporate life. Because they want to transfer wealth to their families. And I think this is where this comes into play, because it's not just a matter of just building wealth, it's how you maintain it and then how you transfer that wealth. It's a very important factor. You're having a lot of material here. How have trust and other wealth vehicles evolved over the past 20 years?
So if you go back, call it 25, 30 years ago, the statistics were something like 25% of all trusts were being handled by large institutions, the Bessemers, the US Trust, the whatever. And 75% were really family member and maybe friends of the family. And that was the traditional trust structure. And then what started happening was families wanted more control. Families' wealth was not so much marketable securities anymore, but, real estate and farms and equity and startups and cryptocurrencies and what have you. And a lot of the institutions were getting uncomfortable with handling these assets, number one. And number two, the fee structure was one lump fee. And they wanted transparency on what the fee looked like. And some really smart people started looking at it, and they created what we now call the directed trust environment. And that created a whole new business. You can go to South Dakota 25 years ago and see how many trust companies there were. I think it was 0. And now there's well over 100 serving that administrative role. And other states followed suit. So you've got Nevada, Alaska. I mean, we can go through, and that's changing. And it was with the adoption of the Uniform Trust Act that different states started looking at what are we doing, and that's still evolving. And once that started evolving, it gave people more flexibility to create some of the structures that I'm talking about today. So I think this collision of extraordinary wealth in many different forms with the changing laws have created this entirely new industry.
And you're right. I was thinking, as you talk about extraordinary wealth, I think about the very obvious, and that's the entertainment and athletes. This would have never existed 20 years ago. We're seeing in the wealth that they're creating, not just in their sports, but even after their profession. But aside from that, they're building businesses and buying into corporations and franchises and real estate and becoming, I look at Shaquille O'Neal, isn't he a billionaire now?
Yeah, and it's so interesting that you mentioned that. I've just come back from 2 conferences over the last, I guess, since May. So a conference in May and a conference in July, where they had panels of athletes that were extraordinarily entrepreneurs. I mean, it was so fascinating to see what they're trying to do with their wealth, and really exciting, actually, because up until recently, it felt like, I don't have the facts or the statistics, but whether it was entertainment or athletes, I guess they're kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
They were being managed and they weren't being educated. And now they've got people really sitting them down and helping them educate, and they're giving back to the communities in extraordinary ways. I love it.
In fact, my next speaker, I'm going to get probably next week, that's what she works with, is entertainers and athletes, and that's what they do. They educate these people on what to do with their money while they're still in their profession, so that while they move along, they're prepared for growing their wealth. And that's where my family office is. We're looking at that entity of it, not just, I've moved away from product sales. I no longer sell securities or insurance. I stopped doing it. I can educate on it, but I want to do more than just look for a commission. I want to be able to offer high quality service. So I look for people like you to bring on, but then we'll be reaching out to. So I'm glad you're here. What should families be thinking?
I want to stay there though for a second, because I've only seen 2 panels and talked with the folks after the panels twice, right? So you've got way more insight. But I kind of got the following questions. I've been told I need a family office. Should I have a family office? I'm like, well, what are you trying to solve? And then they're off to the next thing. So while I think that we're in the early stages of having these people do great things with their wealth and build, entrepreneurship, there's a next step. And I hope that people start talking about, what do you really want to do now that you're building the wealth with your legacy, and set it up today? And what are you doing to talk to your children about it? Because maybe those children aren't going to be entertainment or athletes, but they're going to be entrepreneurs. They're going to be founding businesses. But it's that whole financial education to those entertainment professionals and their family members, which is what gets into what I do.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's exactly what it is. All their kids are not going to make it to play sports. Mm-hmm. And they're not all going to be on stage. And some of these kids, isn't Bill Gates' daughter a doctor?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so all the kids don't necessarily want to follow into the family footsteps, but they do need to have the education on how to manage that wealth going forward.
And what it means. Like I know a lot of families, people are getting much better at talking to the next generation about their wealth and the structure, but it's not there yet. And what I see on these dynamics is that people can't find their voice because they don't know what the structures mean. There are a lot of organizations out there who do beneficiary education and trustee education, because that's how we're going to keep these families together and in the same direction. So you can be a doctor, but you can also be participating on the councils on what do you want to see from a legacy perspective and a philanthropic perspective. But if you don't know what these vehicles do, if you don't know what your rights are, and if you don't know what the goals and objectives and what you're not supposed to do with it, you're not going to have that family great, continuing legacy.
It's an important factor. Not only is that case, but sometimes when these people pass on, particularly in entertainment and athletes, and I shouldn't just pick at them, but I'm going to use them as an example. A lot of times their family members are not even prepared to know what to do with wealth other than spend. Mm-hmm. And that ends the wealth cycle at that point. And a lot of new money, when they first enter into that realm of wealth, the first thing they do is they spend. And I mean, the spending is extravagant. That does not create anything for you. It does not generate revenue, doesn't generate any ongoing income. And that is one of the biggest issues we have when we're looking at anyone in entertainment and sports, is to help. You almost have to drag the whole family into the early phases of it. Again, I'm going to be reaching out to you. So what should families be thinking about in creating their wealth legacy?
I think they should be figuring out what their that's a really complicated question, and there's probably better people to answer that one. But I think people should be really thinking about, what do they want to see as their legacy? And I want to go back to the communication and the education, because if the founders have a vision, but they're not communicating it and working with the next generation on what that means, and giving the next generation the ability to be themselves within a productive role, that it falls apart. And I see a lot of that. I see a lot of, I have a situation right now where, two beneficiaries have exactly the same rights, and the distribution ability is pretty flexible, but the trustee is much more engaged with the sibling who wants to build a business versus the sibling who happens to be the primary breadwinner and trying to create legacy there. So it just comes down to the skill sets, having the breadth of advisors that aren't just about the money, but about what do we want to do for longevity, and give the ability for the next gen to have a voice.
Well, let me ask you, who should families include in their team, and why? Why is it important?
So as I was saying before, they need to have independent and professional trustees, or if they have private trust companies, whatever structure they have, outsource all the things that they don't need to do, right? In some cases, investment is really important because that's where they created the wealth. But let's say they didn't. Have investment advisors, have somebody who's really going to look at the whole investment policy statement and not just what they're running. What do we mean by that? is even in my own world, you know, my investment advisors in the past would say, well, here's what you need to do in your marketable securities, and real estate is getting, you know, really good. You should be more in real estate. And I'm like, are you kidding? My husband's in real estate. I need to diversify. But they were only looking at what they were managing, and big families have a bigger issue. So investment professionals need to be looking at the entire wealth and making it a big global investment policy statement. Then you have to look at the independent, you know, administration. There's a lot that goes into it, from accounting platforms and dashboards and reporting and IRS, the LLCs we're talking about. Hire the right CPAs, hire the right lawyers that are looking at all these people. If you need family dynamics people, get the family dynamics people involved. So it's all those different pieces. And I really believe, and I'm looking at this mostly from a risk perspective, I think the families should be there to make decisions, to guide the future, to get people involved in the financial education, and leave the rest to the professionals. And I'm not in the investment side. There's a lot of families that are way better than, you know, investment professionals. That's fine. But I'm just saying, the places where you can have real risk and real discussions, outsource what you can, or at least get the right advisors on board. And I am going to make one little plug for the property casualty insurance person. You know, it's so funny when I'm in conferences and I say I'm in the insurance business, everybody says life insurance. They forget that the property casualty person actually has insight into risk management. And we're not here to be product salespeople either. We're here to, you know, when people are saying, I'm thinking about this structure versus this structure, or this advisor versus that advisor, we can be in there saying, you need to be intentional, and here's some risk characteristics that you might see with any choice. And then when you make the choice intentionally, then we'll put together the policies that make sense. But we can actually add some insight.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. You kind of jumped on my question. I was going to ask what are the risks and how can you identify and mitigate those risks? And you kind of just want to add to that now that I've asked it, or did you pretty much?
I think it's just really involve them and ask the questions. Just treat your property casualty person like any other advisor, because we all are a team. And if you feel like somebody's just trying to sell you something, it's not the right advisor.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. In fact, I think that's why all of us who have been in the retail side leave it. We really, I think that my whole focus is that I don't want to just want to shove product to get a commission. I do want to be paid. Now, I'm not trying to say I don't want to be paid, but to me, the quality of advice and service I provide for someone is so important, because it truly impacts the long-term of what they're going to receive for their families. I look at the families, I'm going to compare it to the royal families. The reason they exist today is because they were able to transfer that wealth for hundreds of generations. So today you have a royal family because that money and the assets kept going on. Anyway, go ahead.
I think the other piece of that is, as you brought that up, is, as we started saying earlier, this industry is in its infancy, as far as I can tell, because the enormous amount of wealth, all the things we've been talking about. And I think in any situation, if you have the right advisors, we can all ask the right questions. If anybody says they have the answers, they don't belong there, right?
Yes,
but
exactly.
If we're together asking the right questions, we can solve it. And we need to be inquisitive and following the laws and following what's going on, so that we can be nimble enough to protect all of it.
Well, I'm gonna follow up with you because I'm part of a family office network where I'm getting more education on how to become a real quality family office, because it's not just a hodgepodge of people. It really is. It's a legal team that you put together for the sake of the client. Anything you want to add to that before we wrap up for today?
No, just that I really appreciate what you're doing. I find what you're doing fascinating. I really want to emphasize, because it sounds like a lot of your work is with the entertainment industry, and I am seeing such a newfound sophistication that I'm so impressed with what you guys are all doing. I can't say it enough. I was really kind of taken aback by the first panel I saw, and it's really exciting.
Well, it's more than entertainment. It is a lot of small businesses too. But what I look at is that in the beginning, you see nothing, particularly in the business entity. They may be struggling, but then all of a sudden you watch a pattern. It's like watching a stock pattern, and the upshot is so fast and so dynamic until they don't have someone in place. They wind up in a bad position because they get bad advisors. People that don't know how to give high quality advice, and they're sold a bunch of product. That's what happened to a lot of people in the past, and they wound up going bankrupt. I don't want to bring up name, but that's what happened to Scottie Pippen, bad investments, bad advisors. But I think he's back on the right track now. But so it's important to be around the right people to get the right type of advice. So we're about wrapping up at our point here, but I want you to bring anything else you want to before we wrap up here today.
No, I think we've covered everything. Usually you have to have a closing argument, but I guess if you want to just who I am, I have a couple of silos. I have my own underwriting facility for independent and professional trustees, as well as certain private trust companies. And what that means is I make the underwriting decisions, we issue the policies, and is backed by Lloyd's of London. And then on an open market basis, we work with anybody who's serving as trustee, trust companies, and family offices. So that's what I do to make money on my day job.
What I'm going to do, I'm going to take your contact information. It'll be at the front of this video. It'll be a full video and a podcast. And for people to reach out to you, but I'm going to reach back out to you myself personally.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Chantel. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you for joining.